What if I told you that humanity already made first contact with aliens? Not with blazing starships cutting through the sky, not with a broadcast echoing across the airwaves declaring, "We come in peace," not even with the thunder of war engines crashing into Earth's orbit. No. What if I told you the first contact had already happened, quietly, without us even noticing? This is not the story of a dramatic invasion. It is not the story of a desperate defense, nor of humanity's bold expansion into the stars. This is the story of silence, a silence so deep, so well hidden, that for generations we mistook it for nothing at all. Humanity, for all its brilliance, has always been obsessed with spectacle. We imagine aliens as towering figures stepping off their ships in front of cameras, or a sudden flash of light over Washington, D.C., or a mothership blotting out the sun. Our movies, our books, our dreams, they all taught us to look for the obvious. We wanted the trumpet blast, the fireworks, the history-defining moment that could never be denied. So when the moment actually came, we missed it. Because it wasn't loud, it wasn't bold, it wasn't anything like what we expected. It was quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it slipped right past us. It began with whispers. Not the kind you hear in the street or behind a closed door, but the kind buried inside the very fabric of reality. Radio operators in the early 20th century sometimes spoke of strange echoes. A transmission would bounce back, not from the ionosphere, not from satellites that didn't exist yet, but from something deeper, stranger. They called it long-delayed echoes, a curiosity, a technical glitch. Scientists dismissed it with theories: atmospheric reflection, magnetic anomalies, human error. But what if those echoes weren't accidents? What if someone was answering? Later, when we spread our reach further into the stars, the pattern grew. Astronomers spoke of noise in the data, signals too random to be meaningful but too structured to ignore. Static with just a little too much order. Numbers that seemed to appear and vanish without reason. Most scientists shrugged. After all, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this wasn't evidence. It was suggestion. A flicker in the corner of the eye, a shadow in the static. The kind of thing you throw away if you want to keep your career. So we did. We threw it away. But they didn't throw us away. Because if the signs were real, if the anomalies were intentional, it meant someone was already here. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone blending into the cracks of our reality, careful not to disturb the surface. No landing craft, no broadcast, just presence. Like a neighbor who never makes a sound, but you can't quite shake the feeling that they're watching you through the blinds. This is the terrifying part. We were waiting for a grand entrance, when in truth the entrance may have happened centuries ago. Think about it. Humanity measures time in years, decades, centuries. But for a species older than us, 10,000 years older, 1,000,000 years older, our entire history is just a flicker. They could afford to wait, to settle quietly, to embed themselves so deeply that by the time we realized it, they would already be part of the furniture of our world. We looked up at the stars, desperate to find them. But what if they weren't up there? What if they were already here, in our oceans, in our mountains, in the very frequencies of our machines? The invisible arrival. That is the only way to describe it. Imagine this. A species capable of traveling between the stars would know how primitive we are. They'd know our tendency to panic, our addiction to spectacle, our inability to keep secrets. If they wanted to observe us, the last thing they'd do is land in the middle of New York City and say hello. No, they'd slip in quietly. They'd mimic. They'd camouflage. They'd become so ordinary that we'd never think twice. And so the signs of their arrival weren't neon lights in the sky. They were things like a plane's instruments going haywire over a calm sea, a fishing crew swearing they saw lights under the water, a hiker finding a rock formation that hummed faintly when touched, then returning the next day only to find it gone. Little things, forgettable things, the kinds of things we bury in the unexplained mysteries section of late-night television. But when you stitch them together, It doesn't look like coincidence anymore. It looks like a pattern. Of course, the skeptics always win in the beginning. Humanity is good at rationalizing. You hear footsteps in an empty house? Must be the wind. You see movement in the corner of your eye? Just your imagination. You catch whispers in the static of a dead channel? Radio interference? Nothing more. But what if all those explanations were wrong? What if we trained ourselves generation after generation to ignore the very signs of our first contact? The most unsettling possibility is this. Maybe that was the point. Maybe they wanted us to dismiss it. Maybe their arrival was designed not to be believed. After all, what better way to hide in plain sight than to become the story no one takes seriously? The invisible arrival was not a mistake. It was the plan, and humanity walked right into it. We like to think we're ready for first contact, that if aliens ever arrived, we'd meet them with science, diplomacy, maybe even hope. But the truth is simpler and darker. We expected the obvious. We were blind to the subtle. And by the time we realized what had happened, it was already too late. It began with noise, not the kind that rattles your windows or startles you awake, but the kind you don't even notice. The hum of a fridge, the hiss of air in your ears, the faint buzz of a distant machine. We live surrounded by noise, so much so that we stop hearing it. But what if, buried inside that endless background, someone was speaking? In the 1950s, radio operators began to pick up things they couldn't explain. At first, it was written off as feedback, signals looping back through the atmosphere. But then the patterns began. Every so often, a sequence would appear. Numbers, tones, pulses, always just enough to suggest order, but never enough to prove intelligence. To the naked ear, it was nothing but static. To the trained operator, it was maddening, like hearing a half-finished sentence cut off in the middle. Reports surfaced of phantom broadcasts, a voice in the dead of night speaking no known language, whispering for seconds before vanishing. Scientists analyzed tapes and declared it interference, a trick of the ionosphere, a glitch in the equipment. But what if it wasn't? What if those voices weren't echoes of our own? What if they were whispers from someone else? Consider this. If you were an advanced species watching humanity, you wouldn't announce yourself with a booming transmission. You wouldn't risk panic. You'd slip in quietly, disguising your messages as background noise. You'd hide in the static. And maybe that's exactly what they did. As decades passed, the evidence grew. Astronomers reported irregular signals buried inside cosmic background radiation. Computer engineers found repeating anomalies in long-distance data transfers, tiny fragments that looked almost like code. Then came the ocean. Sonar operators on submarines heard things they couldn't explain, tones that mimicked whale songs but weren't T-whales, rhythms that matched no natural creature. Sometimes a sound so sharp and alien that even hardened naval officers went pale. The military dismissed it as deep-sea geology, cracking ice, shifting plates. But the operators knew better. You don't mistake a voice for a landslide. And make no mistake, what they heard felt like a voice. Here's the terrifying part. The whispers weren't global, they were selective. Certain regions of the world reported them more than others. The Arctic Circle, the depths of the Pacific, isolated deserts, places far from human population centers where our eyes rarely lingered. If the signals were random, they would have scattered everywhere. But they weren't random. They clustered, almost as if someone was choosing when and where to speak. In 1977, the WOW signal was recorded, 72 seconds of a strong, unexplained radio burst. It became famous as a possible alien transmission. Scientists debated it for decades, but one detail rarely made headlines. There were other signals, less dramatic, that appeared before and after. Signals so faint that they didn't even get recorded properly. Flickers of intelligence, always vanishing before we could prove anything. What if the WOW signal wasn't an accident? What if it was a test? Not a message to us, but a calibration, like someone checking their microphone before speaking, and then deciding. Not yet. For years, researchers begged for funding to study these anomalies. Most were denied. The scientific establishment has always been brutal to those who chase ghosts. Careers were ruined, data was locked away, but those who listened closely, those who dared to keep digging, noticed something chilling. The whispers in the static weren't just random noise, they were evolving. At first, it was bursts of sound, then patterns, then sequences that mirrored human languages, syllables that sounded almost like speech, but twisted, distorted, wrong, like someone learning to talk by imitating us, but never quite getting it right. Imagine that. Something out there, practicing our voices in the dark. This raises the question, were they trying to speak to us, or were they practicing to speak as us? The possibility is almost too much to stomach. An alien intelligence hiding in our networks, slipping its words into the background hum of our machines, learning our languages, our codes, our habits. Think about your phone dropping a call. Think about your computer glitching for a second. Think about the moment your television fuzzes with static before clearing again. We call it malfunction. But what if, just once in a while, it wasn't? What if, in that millisecond of chaos, something else was there, piggybacking on our own signals? The whispers continued. In the late 90s, internet traffic analysts noticed strange packet losses, fragments of data that didn't fit any known pattern. At first, they assumed it was hackers. Then, they realized it was bigger than that. Some of the missing fragments weren't missing at all. They had been replaced, not with garbage code, with something structured, ordered, precise. To most, it was invisible, just another glitch in the vast ocean of global data. But those who studied it swore the replacements weren't random. They looked like writing. Someone was leaving notes in the bloodstream of our machines. By now, one thing was clear. This wasn't an accident. The whispers in the static were deliberate. They weren't trying to talk to us in ways we could easily understand. They weren't trying to show themselves in a way we couldn't deny. They wanted us to doubt, to hesitate, to dismiss it as coincidence every single time. And we did. We laughed at UFO reports. We mocked conspiracy theorists. We turned strange noises into entertainment. Unsolved mysteries, X-Files, late-night talk shows. We made the whispers into jokes. And maybe that's exactly what they wanted, because by hiding in our noise, by speaking just enough to be noticed, but never enough to be believed, they achieved something brilliant. They became the presence that could never be proven, a shadow in the data, a ghost in the signal, an echo in the static. And all the while, they were learning, watching, studying, not rushing, not stumbling, patient. Because if they'd been here this long without revealing themselves, then one truth becomes unavoidable. They weren't waiting for the right time to arrive. They were waiting for the right time to act. For years, the whispers in the static were the only clue. But whispers alone don't explain the feeling, the uncanny sensation that someone was watching. Not from across the stars, not from some faraway system. From here. It started with the skies. Pilots reported strange lights trailing their aircraft, always too fast, too smooth, too deliberate to be explained away. They called them bogies, phantoms, UFOs. The reports stretched back to World War II, when fighter pilots spoke of glowing orbs, Foo Fighters, that danced around their planes before vanishing into the night. The government called them hallucinations, stress, combat nerves, but every pilot who saw them knew better. Machines don't hallucinate. Radar doesn't panic. Yet the instruments confirmed what the eyes saw. Something was out there, something intelligent. Then came the oceans. Submariners spoke of shadow contacts, unidentified shapes moving faster and deeper than any known vessel. Whole sonar arrays would light up with impossible readings. Metallic masses gliding silently through trenches miles below the surface. When ships tried to pursue, the contacts vanished, as if swallowed by the sea. Some sailors swore they saw shapes beneath the waves. Not whales, not sharks. Geometries too perfect, too unnatural. Others spoke of lights flickering deep underwater, like cities in the abyss. Officially, it was dismissed as sonar glitches, thermal layers, tricks of the deep. Unofficially, it was something else. Something that had no business being there. But the most disturbing encounters weren't in the sky or the sea. They were on land, hikers in remote mountains finding structures that shouldn't exist, perfectly smooth stone walls hidden in the wilderness, vanishing when revisited. Farmers reporting figures in their fields, tall and motionless, watching from the tree line before melting into the shadows. Children speaking of the quiet people who appeared at night, standing in the corners of their rooms, silent as statues. Always gone before parents arrived, always forgotten, until the stories started piling up. We told ourselves these were myths, folk tales, the same stories we've always told around campfires. But what if they weren't myths? What if the silent observers were real? Think about it. If an advanced species wanted to watch us closely, they wouldn't send obvious drones or flashing lights. They'd blend into the world we already know. Maybe those glowing orbs in the sky weren't ships at all, but probes, machines disguised as natural phenomena. Maybe the shapes under the ocean weren't crafts, but constructs grown to mimic biology, hiding among whales and sharks. Maybe the quiet people weren't ghosts or hallucinations, but something else. Something standing there, perfectly still, while we dismissed it as imagination. The unsettling part is that the observers never interfered. They didn't stop wars. They didn't offer technology. They didn't reveal themselves in any undeniable way. They only watched, as if humanity were an experiment in a glass tank, and they were the scientists taking notes. Some evidence is harder to dismiss. In 1981, a forestry worker in France reported seeing a metallic craft land in a clearing. He described two small figures inspecting the soil with strange devices. When they noticed him, the craft emitted a blinding light and vanished. Investigators found scorched marks on the ground and abnormal levels of radiation. The official report called it inconclusive. But what if it was something else? A survey mission, a routine check, a data-gathering trip, no different than a biologist tagging a wild animal before releasing it. That's the pattern. The observers never come to us openly. They appear at the edges of perception, gather their data, and leave. Which raises a terrifying question. What exactly are they studying? If you were watching humanity from the shadows, what would interest you? Our wars, our politics, our technology, or something deeper? Some believe the observers are studying our biology. Reports of strange scars, missing time, and sudden unexplained illnesses have fueled stories of abductions. People vanishing for hours or days, then returning with hazy memories of bright lights and figures leaning over them. Science dismisses it as sleep paralysis, psychological episodes, but what if it isn't? But what if the silent observers aren't just watching from the outside, but examining us up close, testing our limits, mapping our DNA, learning how our bodies work and how they fail? Others believe it's not our bodies they want, but our choices, our morality, our unpredictability. History shows that whenever humans are cornered, we adapt. We fight back in ways no one expects. We weaponize anything we can, from sharpened sticks to nuclear fire. No other species we know of does this, not with such desperation, such creativity. Maybe that's what makes us interesting to them. Maybe they're not just observing humanity. Maybe they're measuring us. Here's the most chilling theory. What if the observers aren't visitors at all? What if they've always been here? Ancient myths speak of gods descending from the skies. Folklore tells of strange beings watching from the forests. Civilizations around the world tell eerily similar stories of star people, sky beings, the hidden ones. Were those myths just imagination, or were they fragments of encounters with the same silent observers we sense today? If that's true, then humanity has never been alone. Not for a single moment of our history. And if they've been here this long, then why haven't they revealed themselves? The answer may be as simple as this. They're waiting. For what? We don't know. Maybe for us to reach a certain level of technology. Maybe for us to weaken ourselves beyond recovery. Maybe for something only they understand. But waiting is not harmless, because the longer they watch, the more they know, and the more they know, the less control we have. The silent observers aren't a future threat. They're a present one, already here, already watching, already shaping the edges of our world in ways we can't yet see. The truth is, we don't need to wonder when first contact will happen. It already did, and by the time we finally notice, it may not be contact anymore. It may be conquest. For decades, the signs were scattered. Whispers in the static, shadows in the sky, lights in the ocean depths, easy to dismiss, easy to laugh at. But every lie has an expiration date. Every mask eventually slips. And when the silent observers finally revealed themselves, it wasn't with a greeting, it was with control. It began suddenly, without warning. One morning across the globe, power grids flickered. Not just in one city, not just in one country, everywhere. Lights dimmed in New York, then surged back to life. Elevators froze in Tokyo. Generators roared to life in Johannesburg, only to fail seconds later. At first, governments assumed it was a cyber attack. Hackers, terrorists, some rogue state testing its reach. But the truth became clear within hours. This wasn't sabotage. It was synchronization. The grids weren't failing at random. They were failing in sequence, falling dark in a pattern too perfect to be chance. It was a message. Next came the skies. Satellites, hundreds of them, began to drift from their orbits. Not destroyed, not jammed, just nudged, pushed with surgical precision into useless dead paths. Military satellites, weather satellites, communication relays, all turned one by one as if a giant invisible hand was rearranging them like pieces on a chessboard. Engineers panicked, thrusters fired, commands were sent, corrections attempted. Nothing worked. It was as though the satellites had stopped listening to their human masters and started obeying someone else. Within 24 hours, the world was in chaos. Phone lines went silent, flights were grounded, banks froze, and yet in the middle of it all, there was no demand, no voice, no alien face on a broadcast screen, just silence. The silence of an intelligence that didn't need to speak to prove its power. By now, denial was impossible. Governments that had laughed off reports of observers, that had buried data and mocked witnesses, were forced to face the truth. They weren't myths. They weren't glitches. They weren't hallucinations. They were real. And they had been here all along. The world split in two. Some demanded we fight. Some demanded we surrender. Most simply didn't know what to believe. In Washington, generals argued over launching nuclear weapons into orbit, desperate to prove humanity could fight back. In Moscow, old Cold War bunkers were reopened, filled with men and women whispering about the end of days. In Beijing, officials denied everything, even as their own systems collapsed in front of them. And yet, nothing happened. The observers didn't land troops. They didn't fire weapons. They didn't enslave us or demand tribute. They only pulled back the curtain, showing us what they could do, like a magician who finally reveals the trick. For ordinary people, it was worse. Millions took to the internet, posting footage of the anomalies, lights in the sky, impossible shadows moving across cities, power surges rippling in waves like unseen tides. Videos spread faster than governments could delete them. Conspiracies exploded overnight. And for the first time in human history, the skeptics had nothing to stand on. There were no excuses left. No weather balloons. No swamp gas. No equipment malfunction. The observers were real, and the world knew it. But the most chilling revelation came not from the skies, not from the seas, not even from the power grids. It came from the people. All across the globe, ordinary men and women began to share stories, memories they had buried, dismissed, or forgotten. of figures standing at their bedside, of lights in the woods, of missing hours, missing days. And suddenly those stories didn't sound like madness anymore. They sounded like pieces of a puzzle humanity should have put together centuries ago. The unmasking wasn't just about technology, it was about memory. The observers hadn't just been watching us, they had been touching us, interfering with us, shaping us in ways we still couldn't comprehend. And when the world realized this, panic turned to something worse: doubt. Think about it. If they could hijack our satellites, if they could control our power grids, if they could appear and disappear at will, what else could they do? Could they alter our thoughts, our history, our reality itself? How much of what we believed about our own world had been subtly rewritten by hands we never saw? The more people thought about it, the less sure they were of anything. The final straw came when a team of scientists in Geneva released a discovery. They had analyzed fragments of those glitches in global data, the whispers in the static that had haunted researchers for decades. And what they found was undeniable. It wasn't random. It wasn't natural. It was code. Not human code, not machine code. Something older, stranger. A language that rewrote itself, recursive, fractal, endlessly evolving. And inside that code, buried like a signature, was a symbol. The same symbol had been carved into rocks in the Atacama Desert. The same symbol had been found in ancient petroglyphs in Australia. The same symbol appeared in grainy videos of lights in the sky, burned into the clouds for a single flicker of a second. A circle, broken at the edges, spiraling inward. The mark of the observers. The unmasking was complete. They weren't whispers anymore. They weren't shadows anymore. They were here. They were real. And they had always been in control. The question now wasn't if humanity had made first contact. The question was, had humanity ever truly been free? The world had changed. No longer whispers, no longer shadows. The observers had revealed themselves, not with faces, not with voices, but with control. And for the first time, humanity understood the truth. We were not alone. We had never been alone. Panic spread like wildfire. Markets collapsed. Borders tightened. Religions split between despair and newfound purpose. Some called the observers gods. Others called them demons. But above all, there was fear. Fear that we were nothing more than livestock, that our history had been a farm, our achievements allowed only because they served some purpose we couldn't yet see. Fear that the unmasking wasn't the beginning of contact, but the beginning of harvest. Yet in the heart of that fear, something else began to stir. Defiance. Because if the observers thought humanity would simply kneel, they hadn't been paying close enough attention. It started small. In hidden basements, hackers reactivated dark networks, building tools to trace the alien code. In abandoned hangars, engineers began welding together machines that weren't on any government's books. In remote deserts, old satellites were dragged from their graves, rewired, repurposed, rearmed. The world had been united before, by wars, by disasters, by fleeting moments of hope. But now, for the first time, it was united by something else: survival. The observers were patient. They didn't strike. They didn't push further. They waited, as though curious about what humanity would do next. Maybe they expected surrender. Maybe they expected collapse. But instead, they got something else. They got us. Humanity has always been underestimated. Stronger predators once ruled the earth. We outlasted them. Armies with better weapons once conquered nations. We outsmarted them. Nature itself tried to kill us with ice, fire, and plague. We endured. What other species builds fire from nothing, steel from stone, machines from dreams? What other species dares to look at the endless night sky and say, "Mine"? We are fragile. We are breakable. But we are relentless. And that is something no observer could ever calculate. The response began not with armies, but with an idea. A simple message broadcast into the static, hidden in the very frequencies the observers had used against us. Not a plea, not a surrender, a challenge. It read, "We see you now. Your silence is over. Try us." The observers didn't answer, not directly, but the world felt the shift. Lights appeared in the skies more openly now. Blackouts returned in waves, almost as if the observers were testing our resolve. But humanity didn't stop. We adapted. Where the observers shut down satellites, we built ground-based systems. Where they disrupted power, we revived old machines, analog tools immune to digital sabotage. Where they controlled the skies, we dug into the earth, carving bunkers and networks in places their signals couldn't reach. For the first time in centuries, the playing field wasn't tilted entirely in their favor. The defining moment came 6 months later. A global blackout struck again, but this time, humanity was ready. Generators spun up, backup grids lit the cities, networks rerouted, and for the first time, when the observers reached into our machines, we reached back. Hackers across 3 continents injected human code into the alien signal, scrambling it, corrupting it, forcing their perfect sequences into chaos. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the observers faltered. The skies went dark, the static went silent, and humanity realized something staggering. The observers weren't invincible. That was the spark. Suddenly, everything changed. What had once been fear became determination. What had once been panic became preparation. The world's scientists, once divided, now shared data in secret channels. Militaries that had been enemies now exchanged strategies. Ordinary people, students, farmers, workers, became soldiers in a war no one had declared, but everyone understood. This wasn't about governments anymore. This wasn't about nations. This was about us. The observers had patience. We had stubbornness. The observers had control. We had chaos. And in that chaos lived something they had never accounted for: ingenuity. Because no matter how perfect their systems, no matter how advanced their technology, the observers could never predict what humanity would do next. They could not predict fire in the hands of cavemen. They could not predict steel ships cutting across oceans. They could not predict rockets piercing the sky, and they could not predict us now, standing in the dark, staring back at them with fire in our eyes. Here is the final truth. Humanity is not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the fastest, nor the smartest, nor the oldest. But we are the most dangerous, because we do not stop, because we do not yield. Because when you push us to the edge of extinction, we don't fall, we leap forward. And now the observers know this too. They came as shadows. They came as whispers. They came as silent gods, expecting to rule unseen. But in revealing themselves, they made one fatal mistake. They woke us up, and humanity, once awake, is something no power in the universe should ever underestimate. So if the observers are still watching, and we know they are, then let this be our message. We were blind. We were slow. We were prey, but not anymore. Now, we see you, and we are coming.